The grand courtroom of the Jefferson County Superior Court buzzed with quiet chatter as people settled into their seats. The walls, lined with dark oak paneling, carried the weight of countless verdicts rendered over the years. Lawyers in crisp suits shuffled papers, whispering last-minute strategies to their clients. Court officers stood with their hands folded behind their backs, watching the room with an air of practiced authority. At the center of it all sat Judge Raymond Prescott, a man known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor. His graying hair was slicked back, and his eyes scanned the room with the usual mix of boredom and condescension. He had seen all types walk through his courtroom: hardened criminals, desperate defendants, arrogant lawyers. But today, his attention was drawn to something unusual. A teenager had just walked into his courtroom, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as Xavier Cole, a 17-year-old black teenager, stepped forward with a confidence that seemed completely out of place. In his hands, he carried a thick, leather-bound folder filled with documents. Judge Prescott arched an eyebrow, exchanging a look with the prosecuting attorney, Miles Kensington, a well-known lawyer who had built his career on aggressive courtroom tactics. Kensington smirked, already dismissing the boy as a joke. Prescott leaned forward. "Young man, I do not know what game you think you are playing, but this is a court of law, not a high school debate club. You have no business standing there." Xavier met the judge's gaze without flinching. "Your Honor, I am here as legal representation for my brother, Elijah Cole." A ripple of laughter and gasps moved through the courtroom. A teenager acting as legal counsel? The very idea seemed absurd. Judge Prescott's smirk deepened. "Is that so? Do you have a law degree I am unaware of?" Xavier's expression remained neutral. "No, Your Honor. But I do have an extensive understanding of the law, and my brother has chosen me to represent him in this case." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "This is not a school project, son. Your brother is facing serious criminal charges. He needs an actual lawyer, not a child playing dress-up." Xavier did not blink. "Your Honor, according to Section 6.3 of the State Legal Code, any defendant has the right to choose their representation as long as the court deems them competent. I have prepared all necessary documentation proving my competence, including case law references, formal legal arguments, and previous judicial rulings where unlicensed individuals were permitted to represent family members in court." The smirk on Judge Prescott's face faltered slightly. The murmurs in the courtroom had shifted. Some people were now whispering in curiosity rather than amusement. Kensington, the prosecutor, leaned over his desk, clearly irritated. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The law may allow for it in rare cases, but this boy has no formal training. Allowing him to represent his brother is an insult to this court." Xavier turned to Kensington with a calm stare. "You seem afraid of what I might do if I am allowed to proceed." The courtroom gasped. The prosecutor stiffened. Judge Prescott tapped his gavel. "Enough. I will be the one making decisions here." He exhaled, then looked at Xavier again. "Since you seem so confident in your abilities, I will give you exactly 5 minutes to convince me why you should be allowed to represent your brother." Xavier nodded. "That is all the time I need." He stepped forward, adjusting his folder, and began speaking. Within 30 seconds, the courtroom was silent. Within 1 minute, the judge was no longer smirking. Within 5 minutes, it became clear to everyone in that room that this teenager was unlike anyone they had ever seen before. The courtroom had been filled with whispers and chuckles when Xavier Cole first stepped forward, but now absolute silence filled the air. Even Judge Raymond Prescott, known for his sharp tongue and impatience, sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Xavier's voice was steady, his confidence unwavering. He placed his leather-bound folder on the defendant's table and flipped open the first page. "Your Honor, let us begin with the facts," Xavier said, his tone professional. "This court operates under the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees every defendant the right to legal representation of their choosing. Furthermore, in Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963, the Supreme Court established that a defendant is entitled to competent counsel, not necessarily licensed counsel in certain situations." Judge Prescott narrowed his eyes. "I am familiar with the case, young man." Xavier nodded. then you know that multiple rulings since then have upheld the precedent that defendants, in extraordinary circumstances, may appoint non-licensed representatives. My brother has submitted a formal waiver, and I have attached precedents supporting this decision. He slid a stack of documents across the table toward the judge. The prosecutor, Miles Kensington, scoffed. Your Honor, this is nonsense. This child is twisting legal loopholes to play lawyer. Xavier turned toward him, his expression calm. I am not twisting anything. I am applying the law. Is that not what we do here? A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Kensington's jaw clenched. Judge Prescott flipped through the documents, his brow furrowed. He was expecting sloppy arguments, poorly written notes, and baseless claims. Instead, the pages contained well-structured legal citations, cross-reference cases, and strategic arguments worthy of a seasoned attorney. He looked back up at Xavier. Where did you learn all of this? Xavier stood tall. I have been studying the law since I was 10 years old. I have attended more trials than I can count, sitting in on legal proceedings, reading court transcripts, and memorizing legal strategy. This is not a game to me, Your Honor. This is my brother's life. For the first time, Judge Prescott said nothing. Kensington, however, was not convinced. He stood from his chair and walked toward the judge's bench. Even if the court allows this, we must address the fact that his brother, Elijah Cole, is facing felony charges. This is not a civil dispute. This is a criminal case. Xavier nodded. That is correct. Kensington folded his arms. Do you even understand what is at stake? Xavier turned, walking toward the jury box with the confidence of a seasoned litigator. I understand it better than you do. Kensington scoffed. Oh, really? Xavier flipped to another page in his folder. The prosecution has built its entire case on the claim that my brother, Elijah Cole, committed armed robbery at a convenience store on the night of March 14th. You have presented a witness statement from the store clerk, security footage showing a masked individual, and circumstantial evidence tying my brother to the crime. Kensington smirked. That is correct. Xavier turned the page. Then explain why the timestamp on your surveillance footage does not match the police report. Kensington's smirk vanished. Judge Prescott leaned forward. Excuse me? Xavier placed two documents side by side on the defendant's table. The police report states that the robbery took place at 8:42 p.m. However, the timestamp on the footage the prosecution submitted shows 9:17 p.m. That is a 35-minute discrepancy. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Kensington quickly grabbed his own files, flipping through them. He had not caught that mistake. Judge Prescott studied the documents, his frown deepening. Mr. Kensington, is this accurate? Kensington hesitated before clearing his throat. There may have been a clerical error in the report, but that does not change the fact that we have a positive ID from the store clerk. Xavier raised an eyebrow. A positive ID? He turned another page. Let us talk about that. He picked up another document and held it up for the court. This is the witness statement from the store clerk, James Whitaker. In it, he claims that he saw the suspect for less than 5 seconds before the individual ran out of the store. 5 seconds. Xavier walked toward the jury. Raise your hand if you think you could accurately describe a masked suspect in 5 seconds, under stress, while fearing for your life. No one raised their hand. Xavier turned back to the judge. The human brain does not process visual information that quickly in moments of panic. Science tells us that memory is unreliable, especially under stress. Yet the prosecution has built their case around a single shaky eyewitness statement. Kensington was now visibly uncomfortable. The witness was confident in his statement. Xavier nodded. Until he was shown a lineup that did not include my brother. Judge Prescott's eyes flicked up. What? Xavier held up another document. 2 weeks before my brother was arrested, the police presented the store clerk with a lineup of 5 men. Elijah was not among them. The clerk could not identify anyone. It was only after my brother was arrested that the clerk suddenly recognized him. More murmurs filled the courtroom. The case was unraveling, and Xavier was the one pulling every loose thread. Kensington's jaw tightened. This does not change the fact that your brother was found with a wallet that belonged to the store's register. Xavier nodded. Yes, let us discuss that as well. He walked over to the evidence table, where a sealed plastic bag held a worn brown wallet. The prosecution claims this wallet was stolen from the store during the robbery. But there is just one problem. Xavier picked up another file. The store owner's statement from 3 months ago. In this statement, he reports that a wallet matching this description was stolen from the store weeks before the robbery even took place. Kensington's eyes widened. Xavier continued. The police failed to cross-reference previous theft reports. If they had, they would have realized this wallet was stolen long before the night in question. My brother was in possession of stolen property, yes, but there is no proof he was involved in the robbery itself. Silence. Kensington's face was now flushed red. This is absurd. We have. Judge Prescott held up his hand. Mr. Kensington, sit down. Kensington froze, then stiffly walked back to his seat. Judge Prescott turned his gaze back to Xavier. For the first time, there was no smugness, no condescension. There was something else, respect. Mr. Cole, the judge said slowly, I do not know where you learned to argue like this, but I will admit that I am impressed. Xavier nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. But I am not finished yet. The judge blinked. There is more? Xavier turned to the jury. Oh, there is much more. And with that, he proceeded to dismantle the rest of the case, piece by piece. The courtroom remained silent as Xavier Cole flipped to the next page in his file. His presence, once dismissed as an absurdity, had now become the center of everyone's attention. Judge Raymond Prescott, who had started the day mocking the young man, now leaned forward with genuine curiosity. The jury, once indifferent, was now fully engaged, their eyes fixed on Xavier's every move. And Miles Kensington, the prosecutor who had walked into this trial with absolute confidence, now sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his case falling apart. Xavier turned back to the evidence table and tapped the plastic bag containing the wallet. Your Honor, we have established that the wallet allegedly stolen during the robbery was actually reported stolen weeks before. Judge Prescott nodded. That is correct. Xavier walked slowly toward the jury, his voice steady. The prosecution claims that my brother, Elijah Cole, was caught with this wallet, and that this is enough to convict him of armed robbery. But let us consider something. If this wallet was already missing before the crime even happened, then how exactly does it prove that my brother was involved? A few jurors exchanged glances. Xavier continued, what we have here is a classic case of confirmation bias. The police, looking for a suspect, found my brother with an item they assumed was stolen during the crime. Instead of investigating further, they built their entire case around that assumption. Kensington stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is speculating about police intent. Judge Prescott held up his hand. Overruled. The defense is pointing out inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument. Kensington's face twitched, but he sat back down. Xavier nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, let us move on to another problem with this case. The surveillance footage. He turned and gestured to a court officer. May I request that the time-stamped footage be displayed on the courtroom screen? Judge Prescott nodded. Proceed. The officer walked over to the evidence cart, inserting a USB drive into the court's display system. Within seconds, the grainy security footage appeared on the large screen. Xavier walked to the front, pausing the video at a specific frame. This, he said, pointing at the masked figure in the image, is the suspect that the prosecution claims is my brother. But there is something you all need to see. He clicked zoom. The image enlarged, focusing on the masked suspect's right wrist. A small tattoo was visible, a distinct flame-like symbol. Xavier turned back to Kensington. Tell me, Mr. Kensington, does my brother have this tattoo? Kensington opened his mouth, hesitated, and then slowly closed his folder. Judge Prescott turned to the prosecutor. Well? Kensington exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Xavier nodded. That is correct. My brother has no tattoos. But do you know who does? He flipped through another file and held up a mugshot of a known gang member, Ricardo Mendez. This is Ricardo Mendez. He has an extensive criminal record, including multiple robberies, and he happens to have the exact same tattoo visible in the footage. Judge Prescott's eyebrows raised. Xavier walked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that my brother was the one in this footage. They want you to ignore the timestamp issue, ignore the unreliable witness statement, and ignore the fact that the actual suspect has already been identified. He turned to Kensington. Tell me, Mr. Kensington, have the police brought in Ricardo Mendez for questioning? Kensington's silence spoke louder than any objection ever could. Xavier let the moment linger before speaking again. I will take that as a no. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this entire case is built on assumptions, unreliable evidence, and an outright failure to investigate. The prosecution has not provided any real proof that my brother committed this crime. Judge Prescott drummed his fingers on the bench, deep in thought. Kensington, now desperate, stood again. Your Honor, even if the defense has raised some questions, we still have the clerk's identification of Elijah Cole. Xavier turned, his voice sharp. You mean the same clerk who failed to pick my brother out of a lineup the first time? Kensington's face reddened. Xavier shook his head. The truth is simple. The police rushed to charge my brother without doing their job. They ignored evidence, they ignored alternative suspects, and they ignored the fact that he had an alibi. Judge Prescott's eyes snapped up. An alibi? Xavier nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution conveniently forgot to mention it. He walked over to his file and pulled out phone records, handing them to the bailiff. These are cell phone records from the night of the crime. At the exact time the robbery occurred, my brother's phone was connected to a Wi-Fi signal at a diner 10 miles away. Judge Prescott reviewed the documents carefully. His expression shifted. Xavier continued. Furthermore, we have 2 employees from that diner who have provided statements confirming that my brother was there the entire time. He turned to Kensington. Would you like to explain why the prosecution failed to investigate this? Kensington had no response. The courtroom buzzed with quiet whispers. Judge Prescott took a deep breath, tapping his gavel once. The room fell silent. His gaze swept the courtroom before settling on the prosecution. Mr. Kensington, it seems that the evidence presented today calls your case into serious question. Do you wish to proceed, or will the state move to dismiss? Kensington's face burned with humiliation. He adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact with Xavier, the judge, and even his own legal team. He had lost. After a long pause, Kensington cleared his throat. The state moves to dismiss the charges, Your Honor. A gasp spread across the room. Judge Prescott nodded. Very well. The charges against Elijah Cole are hereby dropped. Xavier let out a breath. He had done it. He turned toward his brother, Elijah Cole, who sat frozen at the defendant's table. A slow smile spread across Elijah's face before he stood and pulled Xavier into a tight embrace. Thank you, Elijah whispered. Xavier nodded. We are even now. Judge Prescott tapped his gavel again, signaling the end of the trial. He looked at Xavier, his expression unreadable. Mr. Cole, the judge said, I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have never seen anything quite like this. Xavier met his gaze. Neither have I, Your Honor. A small smile tugged at Judge Prescott's lips. You have a future in this field. I hope you know that. Xavier smirked. I do. Judge Prescott chuckled, shaking his head. Court is adjourned. The moment the gavel struck the bench, the courtroom erupted. People stood, murmuring in awe. Xavier had walked in as a joke. He had walked out a legend. As soon as Judge Raymond Prescott's gavel struck the bench, the courtroom erupted into a mix of stunned whispers and applause. People stood, murmuring in awe, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Xavier Cole, a 17-year-old black teenager who had walked in as a joke, had left as a legend. Xavier turned to his brother, Elijah Cole, who was still frozen in place, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. For weeks, he had been sitting in that defendant's chair, watching his life spiral out of control, believing the justice system had already made up its mind about him. But now, with the charges dropped, Elijah was finally free. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for Xavier, pulling him into a tight embrace. You really did it, Elijah murmured. You saved my life. Xavier exhaled, his heart still pounding. I told you I would. A voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, Mr. Cole." Xavier turned to see Judge Prescott stepping down from the bench. He rarely left his seat before court was cleared, but today was not a normal day. The judge approached Xavier, looking him over carefully. Gone was the smirk, the condescension. Now, there was something else in his expression. Respect? Judge Prescott extended his hand. "I misjudged you." Xavier met his gaze, then firmly shook his hand. "You did," Xavier replied simply. A flicker of amusement passed over the judge's face. "You are not afraid to say what is on your mind." Xavier smiled slightly. "I believe that is what makes a great attorney, Your Honor." Judge Prescott nodded. "Indeed." He stepped back, looking around at the crowd of legal professionals who had gathered. "Young man, I have been practicing law for 3 decades. In all my years, I have never seen a courtroom performance like that from someone your age." Xavier tilted his head. "Are you saying I impressed you, Your Honor?" A low chuckle escaped Prescott's lips. "I would say that is an understatement." His tone grew serious again. "What are your future plans?" Xavier did not hesitate. "I will go to law school. I will become an attorney." Prescott folded his arms. "Most people take years to build the kind of skills you just displayed. How did you learn all of this?" Xavier exhaled. "I grew up watching my community suffer because they could not afford competent lawyers. I saw innocent people take plea deals for crimes they did not commit. I saw families torn apart because no one fought for them. So, I decided to learn the law myself. I started studying court transcripts, watching trials, breaking down case arguments. I wanted to be prepared for the day someone I loved needed help." Prescott listened carefully, nodding. "And today, you proved you were prepared." A voice from behind them spoke. "More than prepared." Xavier turned to see a well-dressed black man in his late 40s, stepping forward from the crowd. His salt and pepper hair was neatly cut, his tailored suit exuding authority. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who belonged in the legal world. The man extended a hand. "Jeremiah Lawson, senior partner at Lawson & Tate Law Firm. I was in the gallery today, and I have to say, young man, I have never seen anyone argue a case like that." Xavier shook his hand, still processing what was happening. "Thank you, sir." Jeremiah studied him carefully. "How old are you?" 17. Jeremiah let out a low whistle. 17 years old, and you just dismantled a felony case in front of a veteran prosecutor and a superior court judge. He turned slightly to glance at Miles Kensington, who was gathering his files at the prosecution's table, his face red with frustration. The man who had once been so arrogant and smug now looked utterly defeated. Jeremiah turned back to Xavier. "Where do you plan to study law?" Xavier exhaled. "I have been saving up for law school, but I am still figuring out where." Jeremiah's lips pressed together in thought before he pulled a business card from his pocket. "Come by my office tomorrow morning. We have some things to discuss." Xavier hesitated before taking the card. "What kind of things?" Jeremiah smiled. "I do not believe in wasting talent. And you, young man, have a once-in-a-lifetime gift. I want to talk about mentorship, internships, and making sure you get into the right law school with the right connections." Xavier stared at him, processing his words. This morning, everyone in this courtroom had laughed at him. Now, one of the most respected lawyers in the city wanted to mentor him. Judge Prescott cleared his throat. "I think that is an excellent idea." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Are you actually agreeing with me now, Your Honor?" Prescott chuckled. "Do not get used to it." He straightened. "Now, I believe this case is officially closed. But Mr. Cole," he pointed at Xavier, "something tells me this is not the last time I will be seeing you in a courtroom." Xavier smirked. "Next time, I will be the one sitting at counsel's table." Prescott nodded approvingly. "I have no doubt." As the judge walked away, the courtroom slowly began to empty. Some attorneys stopped to shake Xavier's hand. A few journalists murmured about the Prodigy who had just made legal history. Elijah clapped a hand on Xavier's shoulder. "You really did it." Xavier smiled. "We did it." As they stepped outside, the cold afternoon air hit them, but Xavier barely felt it. His mind was racing. He had come into this courtroom to fight for his brother. He was leaving with his future changed forever. The courthouse doors shut behind them, and for the first time in a long time, Xavier felt something powerful settle in his chest. He belonged here. And this was only the beginning. As Xavier Cole stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of what had just happened finally settled in. The cold air felt different. The city noise, honking cars, murmuring pedestrians, the distant hum of life, all felt different. This morning, he had walked into that courtroom as a nobody in the eyes of the law. Now, he had proven himself to the world. Beside him, Elijah Cole let out a deep breath, stretching his arms as if shaking off the invisible chains that had bound him for weeks. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head, "I still cannot believe it. You walked into that courtroom, and you tore their case apart like it was nothing." Xavier smirked. "It was not nothing. It took a lot of work." Elijah chuckled. "Well, whatever it was, I will never forget it." As they walked toward the curb, a black Mercedes pulled up, the windows tinted. The door opened, and Jeremiah Lawson, the senior partner from Lawson and Tate Law Firm, stepped out. He adjusted his suit jacket, then nodded toward Xavier. "Glad I caught you before you left." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Did you change your mind already?" Jeremiah laughed. "Not a chance." He gestured toward the car. "I meant what I said. You have a rare gift, and I want to help you develop it. Come by my office tomorrow morning. I have already made a few calls to some of the top law schools in the country. They are going to want to meet you." Xavier exchanged a glance with Elijah, who grinned. "Looks like someone just got recruited." Xavier turned back to Jeremiah, nodding slowly. "I will be there." Jeremiah extended his hand. "Good. And Xavier?" Xavier shook his hand. "Yeah." Jeremiah's expression turned serious. "The legal world is not fair. No matter how brilliant you are, there will be people who underestimate you, mock you, and try to shut you out. Today, you prove that you belong in that courtroom. But this is only the beginning. The real fight starts now." Xavier held his gaze. "I have been fighting my whole life. I am not stopping now." Jeremiah smiled. "I did not think you would." He stepped back into his car and drove off, leaving Xavier and Elijah standing on the sidewalk. Elijah clapped Xavier on the back. "Look at you, already making powerful enemies and powerful allies." Xavier smirked. "That is how the game is played." Elijah chuckled. "So, what is next?" Xavier looked up at the towering courthouse behind them, then toward the city stretching beyond it. He had walked into that courtroom to fight for his brother. Now, he knew he was going to spend his life fighting for so much more. Xavier exhaled, a determined smile forming. Now, I changed the system." And with that, he walked forward, toward his future, toward the fight, toward greatness.